Welcome to our study of the book of Daniel. This is a work of the Mediview Church of Christ in Mesquite, Texas. And now, here is Mike Heisel with today's lesson.
Now let us have a little talk with Jesus.
Thank you for studying the book of Daniel with me today. In our study, we've come to Daniel 5, and this is a great chapter for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes language that we use just in everyday speech actually finds its origin in the Bible. We might say, I got by the skin of my teeth. That comes from the book of Job. Sometimes we say, if the blind lead the blind. That comes from Matthew's gospel. And other times we might say, I saw the writing on the wall. As we'll see as we continue studying today, that comes from our chapter, from Daniel chapter 5. Daniel is also a very interesting chapter because it is the only chapter in Daniel that can be precisely dated. We'll see that the events of this chapter occur on the night that the city of Babylon fell to King Cyrus and the Medo-Persians. And from history we know that this occurred on October 12, 539 BC. So we can precisely date this chapter. Now a lot of time has elapsed from the events recorded in Daniel 1 to the events recorded in Daniel 5. We read that the events of Daniel 1 occurred in the third year of the reign of King Jehoiakim. And we read about Nebuchadnezzar besieging Jerusalem and carrying from the temple the various sacred articles, and also taking into captivity Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Well, the third year of Jehoiakim, according to that reckoning, was 605 BC. So Daniel 1 is 605 BC, whereas Daniel 5 is 539 BC. And of course, when you're talking about years in the BCs, the later you go in time, the smaller the numbers get because you're counting down the amount of time until Jesus comes. So Daniel 1, 605 BC, Daniel 5, 539 BC. Now, in Daniel 1, Daniel was a young man. It's generally thought that he was born sometime around 620 BC. So he was about 15 years of age when he was taken captive in Daniel 1. But now in 539 BC, Daniel would be about 80 years of age. Now the events of Daniel 5 follow the events of Daniel 4, not just chronologically, but also thematically. In Daniel 4, you remember we studied about King Nebuchadnezzar, who became so proud as he looked at Babylon, feeling that he had accomplished all of this by himself. And so God strikes him with insanity so that Nebuchadnezzar will understand that it is Yahweh who's sovereign over all the kingdoms of the earth. And he exalts the most lowly and puts them on their throne. And so Daniel 4 ends with this very important statement from Nebuchadnezzar. He says, verse 37, and those who walk in pride, he, that is Yahweh, is able to humble. Well, in Daniel 5, we read about a king who will occupy the throne years after Nebuchadnezzar, and he's not learned the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned the hard way. But he's going to learn in an even harder way that God is one who is able to humble those who walk in pride. Because you see, Daniel 5 records the end of the Babylonian Empire. So in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the great image, and the image had four parts: the head of gold, the chest and the arms of silver, the belly and the thighs of bronze, the legs of iron, and the feet that were partly iron, partly clay. And those represented four successive world empires. And Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, "You're the head of gold." Well, what is the chest and the arms of silver? That's the Medo-Persian Empire. And so what we're reading about in Daniel 5 is that transition point from the head of gold into the chest and the arms of silver. It will be the end of the Babylonian Empire, the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire. And so really Daniel 5 is the fulfillment of a lot of different passages of Scripture. Sometimes, especially in the Psalms, Psalm 74, Psalm 139, you had these imprecatory statements. God, when will you bring judgment on Babylon? Well, Daniel 5 is the fulfillment of those imprecatory statements. Other times you had prophecies of Babylon's end. Think Isaiah 13, Isaiah 21, Jeremiah chapters 50 and 51, or the book of Habakkuk. You know, Habakkuk prophesied just before Nebuchadnezzar conquered Jerusalem, and Habakkuk wrestled with how God could be just when he used the more wicked Babylon to punish the less wicked Judah. And the answer to Habakkuk was, listen, I'm going to use Babylon in this way right now, but then I'm going to bring judgment on wicked Babylon. Well, Daniel 5 is that point in time when the prophecy of the book of Habakkuk that God would punish Babylon, that was fulfilled. So this is a great chapter. Now, it really falls into three sections. Verses 1 to 4, we could say, amount to this. It is an act of pride. Verses 5 through 29 amount to this. It's an act of prophecy. And then verses 30 and 31 amount to an act of power. All right, so now with all of that in mind, let's take up basically a verse-by-verse study through Daniel chapter 5. Verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, in Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar is king. In Daniel 5, Belshazzar is king. But Belshazzar did not immediately follow Nebuchadnezzar. You see, Nebuchadnezzar became king of Babylon when his father Nabopolassar died in September of 605 BC. And Nebuchadnezzar reigned from 605 BC until 562 BC. At Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BC, his son, Awel-Marduk, also known of in Scripture as Evil-Merodach, assumed the throne. And he reigned from 562 BC until 560 BC, when his life was taken in a coup. And his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, assumed the throne at that point, and Neriglissar reigned from 560 BC until 556 BC, and at his death, his son, Labashi-Marduk, took the throne, but he only reigned for 9 months in 556 BC. Then his life ended in a coup, and Nabonidus assumed the throne. And Nabonidus reigned from 556 BC until Babylon fell to the Persians in October of 539 BC. Now you say, okay, hold on. Now, if Daniel 5 records the fall of Babylon to the Persians, and you say that Nabonidus ruled from 556 BC until 539 BC, where does Belshazzar fit in? Well, Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son. And you see, Nabonidus, after ruling for 3 years in Babylon, that is from 556 to 553 BC, he left the city. And he went to Arabia and spent time in Tama. And it's not altogether clear exactly what was going on there. It seems like in the source material you've got some different ideas going on, so it's not clear exactly what he was doing, but he spent at least 10 years away from the city of Babylon. And while he was gone, he gave his son, Belshazzar, the position of co-regent. And so Belshazzar began as co-regent from 553 BC, and he was still holding this role, according to Daniel 5, at the time that Babylon fell to the Persians. Now, this won't be the last time that we read about Belshazzar in Daniel. We'll read about him also in Daniel 7:1. That is, the vision Daniel has there is dated to the first year of Belshazzar. And then we'll read about him also in Daniel 8:1. That is, Daniel's vision is dated to the third year of Belshazzar. But again, Daniel 5, Belshazzar holds this great drinking party for the other officials who are with him in the city of Babylon. Now, what's going on? What are they doing here in this drinking party? Well, let's pick up in verse 2. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now what's going on? Why this party right now? Well, we've already mentioned King Cyrus of the Medo-Persian Empire. And King Cyrus of Medo-Persia is at this time fighting with the Babylonians. And he has been moving west, and he has taken several important towns that belong to Babylon. And he's conquered a lot of territory, and he has his sights set on the city of Babylon. So it seems like what's going on here then in Daniel chapter 5 is that Belshazzar has called his officials together and his wives and his concubines, and in this party they're praising these false gods of gold and silver and wood and stone, etc., and they're pleading with those gods to give them security and to give them victory over Cyrus and over the Persians. Now the very name Belshazzar means may Bel, B-E-L, protect the king. And as we've pointed out in earlier lessons, Bel is another name for Marduk, who is the chief god of the Babylonians. Now, while they're in this party praising the false gods of Babylon and asking them to give them protection against Cyrus, Belshazzar orders that the vessels, the sacred vessels taken from Yahweh's temple in Jerusalem, that we read about being taken in Daniel 1 verse 2, he orders that they be brought in. And they blasphemously fill those vessels with wine, and they drink wine from them. And it seems like what they're doing is they're saying, okay, gods of Babylon, just as you gave us victory over Yahweh and over Judah way back when in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, now give us victory over Cyrus and over the Persians. And so they're blasphemous in that they're assuming that the gods of Babylon were more powerful than Yahweh was. Now, what is Yahweh's reaction to this going to be? Think back other times in history when pagans mistreated sacred objects that belonged to Yahweh and His temple. Think about what God did to the Philistines. When the Philistines stole from the Israelites in battle the Ark of the Covenant in 1 Samuel 4 and then put it in the temples of Dagon in 1 Samuel 5. Think about how God afflicted the Philistines. And so is God going to stand for Belshazzar to act in such a blasphemous way? Well, we've got more to say about Belshazzar drinking from these vessels, but I'm going to save it to a little bit later in chapter 5. So let's notice what happened. Here's Yahweh's reaction, verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. So all of a sudden, out of the blue, as they're drinking out of these vessels from the Jerusalem temple, and as they're praising these false gods, all of a sudden just a hand appears and starts writing on the wall. It kind of reminds you a little bit of the Addams family. Was it Cousin It, just the hand that would walk around? Well, just a hand materializes and writes on the wall. Now, we're not told at this point what's written on the wall, but if you look over to verse 25, here's the writing. It's many tekel parson. I was giving you the King James translation because that's just what I memorized it in years ago. But many tekel parson is what the hand writes on the wall. And now that's Aramaic. You see, the Babylonians spoke Aramaic. That was the court language. And when this is written on the wall, of course, there wouldn't have been any vowels. It would have been only consonants, and it probably was all run together. So, not sure whether or not Belshazzar just couldn't read the writing or just didn't understand what the writing meant. But whenever this happened, naturally, he's scared to death. The text says that his face turns pale and he's so frightened that his legs become weak and his knees were knocking. This does remind us of the language from Isaiah 13, where Isaiah, 150 years before this time, foretells God's judgment on Babylon. And in Isaiah 13, and at verse 6, we're told, "Wail for the day of the Lord." Now, the day of the Lord is this day here in Daniel 5, when the Persians conquer Babylon. The day of the Lord is near. Now, 150 years in Isaiah's time, the day was near because God had determined it. It was decreed. It was so certain. It was as if it was near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. And in fact, we'll see when we look at the interpretation of the writing on the wall, this is God's judgment against Babylon. So truly, this is destruction from the Almighty. Because of this, all hands will go limp. Every heart will melt with fear. Terror will seize them. Pain and anguish will grip them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at each other, their faces aflame. And that's exactly what's happening here in Daniel chapter 5. So what does Belshazzar do? Well, verse 7 of Daniel 5. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed with purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made third highest ruler in the kingdom." So his reaction is the same as Nebuchadnezzar's when he had the dreams in Daniel 2 and Daniel 4. He calls for all the wise men, for all the enchanters, for all the magicians, all the astrologers to come and tell him what it means. And he promises them a reward. And the reward is that they would be clothed in purple, which would be royal wear, that a gold chain would be placed around his neck, and that he would be the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Now you might compare this with what Pharaoh gave Joseph for interpreting the dream in Genesis chapter 41, verses 42 and 43. We won't take time to turn and read it. But you may scratch your head and wonder, well, why third ruler in the kingdom? Why not second ruler in the kingdom? But remember what we pointed out a few moments ago. Belshazzar is not the sole king. Belshazzar is a co-regent under his father. So he's not number one. Belshazzar's number two. Nabonidus is number one. And whoever interprets this then will be number three. Well, what's the reaction of the wise men? Verse 8. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew pale. His nobles were baffled. So again, this is Aramaic, which is a language they understand, but all you have written there are consonants. There are no vowels. It's probably all written together. There's no context, and so they just can't read it. They don't understand what this means, which is very similar to Daniel 2 and Daniel 4. The wise men failed to be able to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams on those occasions. So verse 10, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a king mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." Now, several things we need to unpack from that. First of all, we need to consider who the identity of the queen is. Now, it doesn't seem like the queen would be one of Belshazzar's wives, because when you look carefully back at verse 2, Belshazzar had with him his wives and concubines at this drinking party. And the queen was not there. The queen came in afterward, after the writing was written on the plaster on the wall. So who is the queen? Well, it may very well be the case that the queen would be Belshazzar's mother, Nitocris. Now, what makes this interesting is the following. You see, Belshazzar was not literally the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he's described as the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is his father in the text, but he wasn't literally the son of Nebuchadnezzar. You remember we saw that there were multiple kings between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, right? There was Awel-Marduk, Nerglisser, Labashi-Marduk, and then Nabonidus. But you add to that, Nabonidus was not a blood relative of Nebuchadnezzar. You remember there were a couple of coups between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. And so the control of the throne has changed to a couple of different families then that would reign. So in the Bible, a lot of times, what's meant by father and what's meant by son is not necessarily immediate father and immediate son. Sometimes what's meant is descendant. You know, think of Jesus being the son of David. Well, Jesus isn't literally the son of David, but Jesus is a descendant of David. But then also it's the case in Scripture that it seems like father can mean predecessor and son can mean successor. You see that usage even outside of the Bible. For instance, the black obelisk mentions Jehu, who was king over the northern kingdom of Israel, and it describes him as the son of Omri. Now, Jehu was not a descendant of Omri. Actually, Jehu led a coup that brought to an end the Omri dynasty. But he was the son of Omri in that he was the successor of Omri. So maybe that's what's meant here by father and son, but the fact that we identify the queen here as Nitocris is significant because Nitocris actually was a blood descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. So, either one of those interpretations work. All right, so this raises another question though. Why does Belshazzar not know about Daniel? Now, it's clear that Daniel has continued in some some court position, I should say, not royal position, but court position up until this point in time. Because we saw back in Daniel chapter 1 in verse 21 that Daniel remained there, that is in the Babylonian court, until the first year of King Cyrus. And then in Daniel 8, we mentioned earlier that Belshazzar's mentioned in Daniel 8. In Daniel 8, the third year of King Belshazzar's reign, it's said in verse 1, we're told this in verse 27 of the text. I, Daniel, was worn out, that is from his vision. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. So Daniel is still in the royal court, but Daniel has lost some of his prominence, it seems, by this point in time. Maybe with the various coups and so forth, he's just not as prominent in the royal court as he used to be. So apparently, even though Belshazzar has reigned as co-regent from 553 BC until 539 BC, he doesn't know Daniel personally. And so the queen, again, very possibly Nitocris, informs Belshazzar of these events that happened earlier about Daniel interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Well, verse 13, Belshazzar takes the queen's advice. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed with purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So, Daniel is given the promise of the same reward that the wise men of Babylon were given. If Daniel can read what was written by the hand on the plaster of the wall. Now notice Daniel's reaction, verse 17. Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." You see, Daniel's reaction to receiving a reward in exchange for a prophetic interpretation is basically the same reaction that Elisha gave when Naaman offered to give him gifts because Elisha gave Naaman the instruction that brought about Naaman's healing from leprosy. Daniel says, keep the gifts for yourself. And here is what Elisha told Naaman, 2 Kings chapter 5. And we'll look at verse 17. Well, let me see. Oh, I'm sorry, verse 16. It threw me for a second. Verse 16. The prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. So Daniel and Naaman are of the same spirit. And actually, Jesus taught the disciples to be of the same spirit. In Matthew chapter 10 and verse 8, after choosing the apostles and giving them power over unclean spirits and to raise the dead, etc., he said, "Freely you have received, freely give." Don't accept any rewards for the miracles that you're going to perform. Verse 18. Your Majesty, Daniel says, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Well, we read about that over in Daniel chapter 4. God rules in the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomever he wishes. Daniel 4:25. But because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. And by the way, I'll stop and make this point. You remember when Daniel was interpreting the dream of the great image to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel said to Nebuchadnezzar, "After you, an inferior kingdom will arise." Talking about the Medo-Persians. In the Babylonian Empire, the king had supreme authority. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. But in the Medo-Persian Empire, things will be different. In the Medo-Persian Empire, the king won't have such absolute authority, and that's clear from Daniel 6. Because when we get there, we'll read how that Darius made the decree that for 30 days no one was to pray a prayer to any god except to him, and those who did were to be thrown into the lion's den. Well, Daniel, of course, disregarded that because he obeyed God rather than men. He prayed to God, and he was caught, and he was accused, and when he was accused to the king, we're told in Daniel chapter 6, and verse 14, when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed, and he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sunset to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, "Remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict of the king can be changed." So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. You see, the Medo-Persian king could not just set aside law. The Medo-Persian king had to follow law. So it wasn't the case that whomever he wanted to kill, he killed, and whomever he wanted to spare, he spared, as was the case for Babylonian kings. But then back to Daniel 5, picking up in verse 20. But when his heart, that is Nebuchadnezzar's heart, became arrogant, and this is what we read about in Daniel 4, and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. And of course, that's what the letter of Daniel 4 amounted to. Nebuchadnezzar acknowledging to his entire kingdom that Yahweh was Most High, and Yahweh was the one who put him on his throne. So Nebuchadnezzar wisely learned that lesson. But verse 22, but you, Belshazzar, his son, and again, son either blood son through Nitocris, or son in terms of successor. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Belshazzar knew the story of Nebuchadnezzar being crazy until 7 times passed over him, etc., but he chose not to learn the lesson of humility. Now listen, we would all be wise to learn from other people's mistakes, and to learn when other people reap what they sow, we should learn not to sow the same things. Listen to what is said in Proverbs 19. Proverbs chapter 19. Verse 25. Flog a mocker, and the simple will learn prudence. Rebuke the discerning, and they will gain knowledge. Proverbs 21, verse 11. When a mocker is punished, the simple gain wisdom. By paying attention to the wise, they get knowledge. Listen, we shouldn't have to learn from the school of hard knocks. We should be wise enough to learn from the mistakes of other people. And unfortunately, Belshazzar did not learn that. And so he's going to have to learn the hard way himself. And he's going to have to learn a harder way than Nebuchadnezzar learned it. Verse 23. Instead of humbling yourself before Yahweh, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. And so you were proud against God. You were praising your gods for giving Nebuchadnezzar victory over the true God of heaven. Now I think that's very significant that as Belshazzar is drinking wine from the Lord's cups, the Lord reveals to him through what's written on the wall that he is about to drink from the cup of the Lord's wrath. That's just some really, really interesting imagery. Let me read to you Jeremiah chapter 25. Jeremiah 25. You see, in the Old Testament, well, and in the New Testament, sometimes punishment is described in terms of drinking from the cup of the Lord's wrath. You remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane said, Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. What cup? The cup of God's wrath. In Jeremiah 25 verse 15 we're told, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup filled with the wine of my wrath, and make all nations to whom I send you, that is, as a prophet, drink it. In other words, Jeremiah was to announce God's judgment on these various nations. And so you just go through reading the list, and nation after nation after nation is forced to drink from the cup of the Lord's wrath. But then the passage ends with this statement, verse 26. And all the kings of the north, near and far, one after another, all the kingdoms on the face of the earth, and after all of them, the king of Shishak will drink it too. Well, who is the king of Shishak? Well, a little bit complicated to explain, but that's a cryptogram. Shishak is a cryptogram for Babylon. You see what happens? Babylon, okay, if you just look at the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph through Tau, right, 22 letters. The name Babylon in Hebrew comes from 3 Hebrew consonants, right? Beit, Beit, and Lamed. Beit and Beit are the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Lamed is the 12th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, well, Shishak comes from 3 Hebrew consonants, Shin, Shin, and Kaf. All right, so from the bottom of the Hebrew alphabet, beginning with Tau, the last letter, Shin is the second from the last, and Kaf, if you're counting backwards, is the 12th from the last. So in other words, this is a cryptogram for Babylon. Babylon is second letter, 12th letter, counting from the start. Shishak is second letter, 12th letter when counting backwards. So this is a cryptogram for Babylon. So anyway, after all of these other nations have been forced to drink the cup of the Lord's wrath, then we're told, Jeremiah 25:26, that the king of Babylon will drink the cup of the Lord's wrath. So basically, on the same night that the king of Babylon blasphemously drank wine from these vessels taken from the Lord's temple, from the Lord's cup, and praised the gods of Babylon for giving Babylon victory over Yahweh, that very same night, the king of Babylon will drink the wine of wrath from the Lord's cup whenever Medo-Persia conquers them. So just tremendous imagery in this passage. And I think that it's interesting too, this really neat point, right? So the hand that wrote this message in the king's palace, that hand was sent from Yahweh. That was essentially Yahweh's hand, right? So as the king of Babylon is drinking from these vessels that have been taken from Yahweh's temple, because the Babylonians invaded Yahweh's temple, invaded Yahweh's house. Now Yahweh has invaded the king of Babylon's house and has written this message of doom. So the point is made, Belshazzar, you praise these false gods for being the source of Babylon's greatness, but you did not acknowledge that the true God was actually the source of Babylon's greatness. This true God, verse 23, you did not honor this true God who holds in his hand your life and your ways. And that's right, God holds in his hand all of our lives and all of our ways. You remember what Paul announced to the Areopagus, Acts chapter 17, in him we live and move and have our being. And so verse 24, therefore he sent the hand that wrote this inscription, because you didn't acknowledge that Yahweh holds you in his hand. Yahweh sent the hand that wrote this message of your doom. Verse 25, this is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Now, what does that mean? Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Well, Daniel is going to interpret it. Verse 26. Here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Now, what's interesting is the term Mene, this is Aramaic, but it's the Aramaic form of the Hebrew weight Mena. Mena is a weight. It's a, if you will, a number, a weight. And what Daniel does is he takes these Aramaic terms, these nouns, they all stand for some sort of weight, but they also had a related verb. And so he gives the noun, but then he interprets it in light of the verb. And so this mena, which is a Hebrew weight, the verb form of it is numbered. So God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Your time as king is very limited. It's numbered. In fact, it's just a matter of hours at this point in time. Tekel. Tekel is the Aramaic form of the Hebrew weight shekel, right? But then he goes on to say, you have been weighed on the scales and have been found wanting. So the verb form of tekel means weighed. So, God has numbered your days. You've just got hours left to reign. But tekel, God, the God of judgment, has weighed you. He's judged your actions and he's found you sinful. He's found you unworthy. You've been weighed on the scales and you've been found wanting. And then Perez, you say, well, I thought it was parson. Well, parson is the plural of Perez. Now, again, this is another weight, but then he's going to give the verb in what follows. Your kingdom is divided. You see, the verb form of the weight Perez is divided. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And probably it's the case that he chose Perez here, because not only does it mean divided, but the the consonants in PRS in English, are the same consonants in the name Persia. And of course, it's the Medes and the Persians that are going to conquer Babylon at this particular point in time. So that's the message. Mene, mene, tekel, parson. You are numbered, weighed, divided. Right? Your days are limited. You don't even have days left. You've just got hours left, because God, the God of judgment, has weighed you. He's weighed your actions, and He's found you sinful. He's found you blasphemous. Here you are praising these false gods who cannot see or hear or smell as you're drinking wine blasphemously from these vessels that were once in the temple of the true God. And so that true God has acted, and that true God has raised up the Persians to bring your kingdom to an end. That's what mene, mene, tekel, parson means. Verse 29. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed with purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed third highest ruler in the kingdom. Well, and so Belshazzar keeps his promise. And so at this particular point in time, Daniel is higher than he's ever been. It is Nabonidus, Belshazzar, and Daniel. Wow, that's quite a promotion for one who was carried as an exile from conquered Judah into Babylon. Now he's the third highest ruler in the Babylonian Empire. But of course, Babylon's not going to last. Verse 30. We move to the third section. You remember we said you could divide the chapter up as an act of pride, an act of prophecy, and then an act of power. So verse 30. That very night, October 12, 539 BC, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. You see, what happened was, this is recorded by several ancient historians. Nabonidus the king had really ticked off the priests of the Babylonian gods, because Nabonidus was trying to push the worship of the god Sin. Nabonidus' mother had been a priestess for the god Sin, and the god Sin was a moon god. It's not a Babylonian god, and so he was pushing that, and so upset the priests of the Babylonian gods. And so Cyrus of the Persians, what they ended up doing was they diverted the Euphrates River. You see, the Euphrates River, as we noted last week, ran right through the city of Babylon, but they diverted it. And so the riverbed was dry. And so Cyrus and the Persians marched in on that dry riverbed, and the priests of the gods of Babylon, so upset with Nabonidus, they actually let the Persians in the city. And so that very night, one ancient historian says that it was King Cyrus himself who broke in to the palace of Belshazzar and killed him that night. Truly, God brought judgment on Belshazzar that very night. Now then, verse 31 says, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now, there's great debate over the identity of Darius the Mede. And I've gone 43 minutes, I think, rather than giving my suggestion as to the identity of Darius the Mede, I'm going to save that until we get to chapter 6. I think that would be the better time to do it, because I think it won't take quite as much time to get through chapter 6. And so we'll have more time to really unpack who Darius the Mede is. So, major lesson that we learn from this is that God holds us all in His hand. Let us always be humble enough to admit that. And let us all live our lives in reverence toward Him, not in any way through prideful blasphemy. May God bless you. Enjoyed studying this with you.
We thank you for taking the time to worship with us and to study a portion of God's Word. We pray that this has been an edifying experience and that you would join us again. Now, if at any point during the lesson you had some questions, please feel free to email us at mheisel@metaview.org. The email is both on the screen and in the description below. It is our goal to answer every Bible question with a Bible answer, to speak where the Bible speaks, and to be silent where it is silent. God bless you. We love you.